Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Graham Boucher. I'm director of the Jack W. Peltison Center for the Study of Democracy, and today I'll be moderating today's talk. We are extremely fortunate today to be joined by Professor Hahrie Han, Professor Elizabeth McKenna, and Professor Michelle Oyakawa to present work from their important book, Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America. Professor Han is the inaugural director of the Stavros Foundation, Agora Institute, and professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. Professor McKenna is postdoctoral scholar, also at Johns Hopkins University, and Professor Oyakawa is, in a really exciting update, now assistant professor at Muskingum University in Ohio. So congratulations on the accomplishment, and good luck to you in the new job. Today, their talk will be on Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America, available through Oxford University Press, University of Chicago Press, I apologize. And as the talk occurs, audience, please use the question and answer function to the lower right of the board to send your questions to me as moderator and the audience. It's very nice if you send these questions whenever they occur to you, and we will raise them either in the discussion at the end of our talk or in real time during the talk. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists for their discussion. So please join me in giving a Zoom welcome, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Graham, and thank you so much for everyone for coming. We're only sorry that we can't be there in person. Certainly it'd be lovely to be in Southern California right now, but really excited to have this conversation with you all. So as Graham said, this is really it's a presentation about a book that Liz and Michelle and I, we've been working on for a few years, and it should be coming out hopefully in April or May of this year. And so the book is called Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America. And I'm just going to introduce it and then really frame it up I turn it over to Liz and Michelle to present most of the work to you. But the outline of what we wanted to do today is start with a conversation about why we felt like we wanted to sort of take on this project, think about the challenge. And I think the challenge kind of really came from a lot of the work that we were seeing in relationships that we had built with a lot of organizers and social movement groups out mostly in the United States. And so Liz, Michelle, and I all do research in a way where we're deeply in partnership with a lot of grassroots organizations, and particularly organizations that work with low-income communities of color. And it felt like one of the challenges that continued to come out was that ex ante, when a social movement is beginning its work, probabilistically speaking, the most likely outcome is failure, right? That most social movements don't necessarily achieve power on the kind of visible outcomes that they're trying to achieve, whether it's passing a big policy, winning an election, passing sort of winning other kind of initiatives. And so status quo bias in American politics meant that they're often most likely to lose. But it felt like, what we were seeing in a lot of the work that's going on is that as people who've spent a lot of time around movements know, is that movements can often lose a campaign, but still win political power. Yet as social scientists, we don't necessarily have good tools for being able to assess if and when that happens. And second, in terms of thinking about the ways in which movements were building and doing that kind of work, it felt like we knew a lot more from the research on what movements needed, as opposed to how they were to combine the things that they needed into the power that they wanted. So we know from previous research about the kind of political resources and opportunity structures that movements needed to be able to achieve their work, but we didn't necessarily know as much how they strategically combine those things together. And so it's like giving a cook a list of ingredients without necessarily giving a recipe. And not that this book gives a recipe by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, we pushed back on that idea, but we wanted to at least think about whether or not there are any commonalities that we could begin to observe. The other thing that I will say that I think motivated the project is the idea that increasingly it felt like we were in a movement moment in politics all around the world, not only in the United States, in the sense that we saw more and more protest and more activism kind of pouring out into the streets, but that government was increasingly less responsive. And so it felt like there was this mismatch between participation and power, as we would put it is one way of putting it. But that there were movements or organizations that were breaking through. And so one of the questions we wanted to ask is whether or not there were any commonalities across the movements that were breaking through. And so the way that we frame the question in the book is really this question of how do vehicles of collective action build and exercise political power, given how improbable their work is. So can we learn from these outlying cases? And throughout the talk, we use the word organization or movement to kind of refer broadly to this idea of vehicles of collective action, recognizing that there are many different forms that they can take. So we're not necessarily making a bet on whatever kind of form, what the right form is. And so the way the talk is going to unfold is I'm just going to say a couple more words to frame up the question, and then Liz will take us through the data and methods that we use and the cases that we study in the book, and then Michelle will walk us through a specific case that we talk about, and then kind of lay out the argument around the prism and why we use that word, why we use the metaphor of prisms to talk about what we found. And so before I turn it over to Liz, the last thing that I'll just sort of say is a couple words on how we're thinking about what we mean by political power. So the first point is we're drawing on research, in political science. Frank Baumgartner and a bunch of other colleagues did some work looking at, what were the kind of resources that were most predictive of political change. And they're looking at the US Congress, but we're using that as just like an example for how we think about change in a variety of different arenas. And I think one place that we would start with this idea that resources aren't necessarily the same as power. And this is something that a lot of social movement scholars have found. In fact, so many scholars at UC Irvine, which is one of the reasons why we're so sad not to be able to have this conversation in person with you all. And so we sort of start with that premise too, that just because you have a lot of money or have a lot of people or have a lot of activists even, doesn't necessarily mean that you have political power. And so we want to differentiate the study of power from the kind of accrual of resources. Second, we want to sort of take into account the kind of notion from Stephen Lukes and other folks that there's three faces of power, right? Power is exercised at multiple levels. And that while we are best as social scientists at measuring the visible exercise of power, whether it's winning a vote on the city council, winning the vote in an election, or passing policy, that we also need to understand the way power is exercised at second and third phases of power. What are the ways in which the choices of movements are constrained or expanded, right, through the work that they do? How are they able to set the agenda? How are they able to shape the narratives and so on that shape the second and third phase of power more often? And then third, we sort of took power to be exercised in the context of a relationship. And so here we build on a lot of, I think, thinking from people like Marshall Gantz, where the idea is that power is not a thing, but it is a relationship, right? And so a movement, often I think we talk about movements as if they have power, as if it's static trait, like the NRA has power, the Sierra Club does not have power. I have black hair today, I have black hair tomorrow, so these are things that we would think of as static traits, but we sort of think about power as being dynamic in the sense that a movement can have power in one instance, but not in another, but it depends on their relationship to their target, and so the way that we think about measuring powers in the context of specific campaigns and in relationship between movements and the targets that they have. And so with that, I will turn it over to Liz to kind of pick up the conversation on the study.
Great. Thank you, Hahrie. Thank you, Graham, Akua, and Andy also for this great talk. It's so nice to be giving a talk about organization with such a well-organized talk. And so I'm going to jump right into our data and methods, as Hahrie said, tell you a little bit about the study based on those premises that Hahrie walked us through. So how did we select our cases? How did we measure the dependent variable, these power shifts in the way Hahrie described? And then what were the commonalities? How did we investigate the kind of organizational level variables that they had in common? So the way we did this was with a multi-year, multi-method comparative case study of outlier cases where power was built. And our dependent variable, the outcome we were most interested in measuring was whether or not we could observe shifts in power in that kind of multi-dimensional dynamic way that Hahrie described. And the independent variables in the language of social science was about the practices that the organizations engaged in that helped them build power. So the figure you're looking at right here shows you sort of the theoretical intuition behind this. We know that there are structural and contextual factors that influence whether or not a movement will succeed or fail. And we know that there are organizational capabilities that will affect that as well. And all of these things interact with one another. So part of what we wanted to do in our case selection was take into account the fact that there were structural and contextual factors that almost always influence whether or not the movement will succeed or fail. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we did that. But just drawing on a little bit more of the research that we were kind of engaging with is that if you thought about sort of the movements having low resources or high resources and low power or high power, you could think of a number of different studies or cases that fall into these different boxes. So Hahrie mentioned the NRA, Matt Lacombe's new book over in the high resource, high power box falls there. Theda Skocpol has a study about the billions of dollars that poured into the climate movement. So very high resources, but relatively low power, given what we would have expected with how much money they had. We can think of lots of organizations, as Hahrie said, the status quo, where both under-resourced groups that also have a very difficult time wielding power. But we were most interested in this sort of low resource, high power box. Marshall Gans, as Hahrie mentioned, has written about movements that have a comparison between the Teamsters, a very well-resourced union in California in the 1970s, as compared to the relatively under-resourced United Farm Workers, and how was it that the group that had relatively fewer resources was able to prevail. And similarly, Elizabeth Clemens in her book, The People's Lobby, writes about a number of different groups, including women's movements, who at the time didn't even have the power of the vote, but yet were able to wield power and shift policy. So we were interested in cases that fell there. And the way we did it first was by engaging in about 15 expert interviews. So we did long form interviews with people who had knowledge of different movements that were contemporary movements throughout the United States that had succeeded in one way or another. And then we took account of all of the cases that came up repeatedly in those interviews about these kind of outlier success cases, and looked at where they were happening. Where were those groups located? What were the arenas in which they were operating? And how could we sort of build an analytic strategy around studying what they had in common? The way we did that was by varying, as I was saying, the structural and contextual factors known to affect the outcome. So the 4 deep dive cases that we ended up doing were in Arizona, Minnesota, Ohio, and Virginia. And so we looked at a number of variables. What was the political landscape? Who had been in power at the state level? Was the state a swing state or not? Over the past 2 decades, all 4 of these states have been considered swing states. Was the population growing? What was the economic landscape? What was the density of civic organizations per 1,000 members? And then what was going on with other kind of in the civic landscape in terms of union member rates? And so what you see sort of with this analysis is that there's lots of different colors on this slide, meaning they were kind of all over the map. So we had, a state like Arizona where the population growth has been growing among the fastest in the United States, but had, as one of our interviewees put it, was sort of a civic desert or in terms of the number of civic organizations that were there. Contrast that with Minnesota, which was in the top 15, but had lower population growth. And then in Ohio, the population growth was decreasing, as was their union and membership rates. And so part of the reason that we went through this process of trying to understand sort of where the context in which these movements were operating is that it would be really simple to explain whether or not these movements succeeded based on a favorable political opportunity structure. So if they all had that, then we wouldn't be able to analyze whether or not there were organizational level or meso level characteristics that they shared. But because they didn't share those external political factors, we were able to zero in a little bit more on the independent variables of interest. So what was in common in those organizations? And so those were our 4 main cases: Arizona, Ohio, Minnesota, Virginia. And then we had 2 shadow cases that cases that we looked at in parallel because we wanted to understand in more depth how the kind of organizational processes and practices that we were observing in our 4 main cases played out in 2 other states. I'm going to go through this table really, really quickly because I'm conscious of time and want us to be able to engage with you and the audience members as much as possible, but just a quick overview of what these cases were. In Arizona, we were observing the immigrant rights movement post SB 1070, the Senate bill that passed in 2010. And we looked at sort of the ecosystem of organizations that grew up around the sort of Joe Arpaio, Russell Pierce, and anti-immigrant legislation that had passed in Arizona. And we looked specifically at a minimum wage ballot initiative that passed in 2016. In Minnesota, we were observing an organization called Isaiah, which around a 2018 gubernatorial campaign that they ran to influence the governor's race there, which Michelle will talk about a little bit in more depth. Our Ohio case focused on a universal preschool ballot measure that passed in 2016 to fund preschool and K through 12 education. This was a coalition of organizations, it was a coalition of organizations, including the business and philanthropic community. And then finally in Virginia, Virginia used to be one of the only states in the nation that permanently disenfranchised formerly incarcerated people. And a group called the New Virginia Majority was able to pass, to change that legislation in concert with the two governors in power at the time, McDonnell, and then finally Terry McAuliffe. And so part of what Hahrie mentioned was that part of our task as social scientists was to observe beyond the visible wins that we knew we were selecting based on these visible wins, whether or not there were kind of other dimensions on which we could examine power shifts occurring. So I'll walk through this fairly quickly as well, but just as a preview, we looked at sort of 3 different domains of power shifts. One was in networks and relational networks, so we use social network analysis. The second was in policy or legislative changes over a longer period of time. And then the third was narrative or discourse shifts. So here are some of the measures that we developed to observe those. In the Ohio case, we surveyed all of the lead actors involved in the universal preschool ballot measure campaign. And the nodes in this graph are colored by which entity or group they represented. So the red nodes are business figures. The orange are the Cincinnati Preschool Promise CPP campaigns. The green nodes are Amos, which was the anchor organization that we were studying in this case. And then dark blue is the Cincinnati Public Schools. So all of this whole constellation of actors were involved in the coalition to pass universal preschool. It was not just the one organization that we were studying. And part of what we wanted to understand was, did the power position of the group we were studying, Amos, the green dots here, shift over time as a result of the way they engaged in this campaign? So we surveyed all of the leaders in this case. We asked them with whom they'd strategized in 2013 and then again in 2016. And this is how the network or the power configuration shifted. So what you're looking at here is the size of the node is weighted by their eigenvalue or their influence score in the network. So the larger the node, the more influence the node wields in the network. And so the leader of Amos, whom we were studying in 2013, was on the outskirts here, barely connected to anyone else in the graph, and after the campaign had completely shifted his power position in the map. This was also true on a different measure we asked about in the survey, which was not just with whom do you strategize, but with whom do you negotiate conflict. So this is the same underlying data, the same set of actors, and this is what the 2013 network looked like. And then in 2016, after the campaign, once again, the leader whose organization we were studying, Amos' power position had shifted to have actually the highest eigenvalue in that network. So what we had here is a case of the Ohio organization that we were studying shifting its power position in the network beyond just winning the municipal ballot measure. We also ran a network survey in Virginia, and in this case, we surveyed the Virginia House delegates, so the Democratic representatives in the state legislature, and we gave them a list of about 50 organizations that are active in the state of Virginia and asked them a number of questions. With which organizations do you strategize in the state? Whom do you reach out to when you want to talk about voting rights? And that yielded this network map as well, where the light teal color that you're seeing here are those other organizations. The red organization is New Virginia Majority, the one that we were studying, and then the dark blue dots are the delegates themselves. So this is what the network map looks like. It's quite densely connected, as we would expect, since these are all Democratic legislators working with left or progressive groups. But the New Virginia Majority, the group that we were studying, once again had among the highest eigenvalue scores. It was fifth, if you ranked order on that measure, behind large national groups like the Sierra Club, Planned Parenthood, and the Virginia Teachers Association. And this was surprising to us. I mean, surprising looking at it from the outside, because we were looking at a group that was less than 7 years old, had a fraction of the budget of all of these other organizations in the state, and yet were able to wield influence among these power targets in a way that the network maps demonstrate. Our Arizona case looked at shift in legislation over time. So because we were observing what happened in the period following the SB 1070 bill passing, so that was in 2010, this is a graph of the ideological makeup of the Arizona state legislature. So we use the Shore-McCarty index. The higher the score, the more conservative the legislature. And so the trend you see here is that both chambers of the Arizona state legislature were growing more conservative over time, which again would predict that more and more anti-immigrant legislation would be able to pass. But when we coded all of the immigration-related bills that came before the Arizona state legislature, we actually found a marked decline in the restrictive immigration bills. So what you're looking at here is the year between 2015 and 2018, and then the y-axis is the count of immigration-related bills. Black we coded as restrictive, light gray as expansive, obviously far fewer. But the absolute number of bills dropped of restrictive bills dropped from 34 to 17. And because we were looking at these bills qualitatively as well, we found a marked decline in terms of how restrictive the bills were post 1070. And then the vertical lines were also two other wins that we observed in the Arizona ecosystem. And this was before Arizona actually flipped in 2020. And the groups that we were studying actually did a great deal of work organizing and turning out voters in the 2020 election. So we could continue this graph and see how that continues to change over time. And then our the final measure I'll share with you was in our Minnesota case. We were looking at discourse shifts and how we might be able to observe power shifts at the level of narrative change. The way we did that was by scraping the Twitter feeds of the gubernatorial candidates that Isaiah, the group we were studying, was trying to influence. So the two candidates were Aaron Murphy and Tim Walz. X-axis is date the change over time. And then what we looked at was we created a corpus of words that the group that we're studying, Isaiah, used to try to influence the target. So these were words like abundance, justice, community, dignity. So there were a number of words that the Isaiah platform and kind of materials that they produced repeatedly used. And we wanted to see, well, did the people that they were trying to target and whose discourse they were trying to shift start to use those words as well? And if you look at the blue shaded area, we found that they indeed they did. This is the time period of the campaign. So prior to the campaign, Walz and Murphy were using maybe one or two of these words in their tweets, and then that shifted markedly at the point in the campaign. So Michelle's going to tell you a little bit about how they were able to do that now that we moved to our shift from the dependent variable over to our findings about what we found these cases had in common. So once we had established that they had shifted power in kind of the on these other dimensions that we were looking at, we wanted to see what did they have in common. And so we use the metaphor of the prism. This is not because we love Pink Floyd, although, you know, that's great as well. But part of what is so helpful about this metaphor is that, as Hahrie said, oftentimes the conventional wisdom is that the more resources you have, the more power you have. And so if we can think of the white light going into the prism, which in this case, the metaphor stands in for the organization, then, you know, if nothing happens inside, there's no transformation, there isn't sort of anything strategic happening, then white light will refract outward. But in a prism, what you have are internal design choices that take white light coming in and refract it outward into this like rainbow or prismatic color. So that's what we found is that the groups, all four of these organizations that we were studying, shared what we're calling a strategic logic. And this is sort of the design choice at the heart of the prism. And this is the way sort of the argument unfolds. The first is that we take as a given that movements work in uncertain contexts. So we started conducting this research right after Trump was elected. Almost none of the groups, or before we even selected the cases, almost none of the experts with whom we were speaking could have predicted Trump. This is a perfect example of how sort of external and exogenous factors can shift, and movements have to react to that terrain no matter what. That's true in almost any circumstance. The second premise is that the goal of the organizations and the organizational leaders that we were studying was not that they wanted to necessarily have an immediate visible win right away. I mean, in fact, a lot of the cases we found that they failed a couple of times or multiple times before. In the Arizona case, they tried to oust Sheriff Arpaio several times before they were actually successful in 2016. Another example of this, a prominent example, not one of our case organizations, is in Georgia. If we look at the Stacey Abrams campaign in 2018, she lost, but yet was still able to build power. So losing on the sort of immediate short-term face of power does not necessarily doom the movement. In fact, the organizations that we were studying were more interested in maximizing their strategic choices for action in the future. So how do they maximize strategic choice? Well, we found that they needed to build flexible, committed, and independent resources. So this meant a base of people that was organized, flexible, committed, and willing to shift as the political terrain changed, which it inevitably did in all the cases. And then we found that cultivating those resources with those characteristics, flexible and committed and independent, was related to the organizational design choices. So here's a picture of sort of what the status quo is that Hahrie mentioned. If you look on the left, it's the status quo is we expect that people, no matter how many of them you have, will always be outweighed by the fat cats, or in this case, I guess it's a fat elephant. But we wanted to understand, okay, well, what is it that the people, so the right side of the scale, can do to cultivate those design choices that allow them to have those resources? And this is what we found. The leaders were accountable to their members. They were building out constantly expanding latticework of relationships, bridging ties as opposed to bonding ties. So one of the things that sometimes we expect in sort of interest group organizations is that people come to those organizations with homogenous interests, homogenous backgrounds. But in all of the cases that we studied, what we found is in many cases, they were working to build multiracial, multi-generational, several of the cases, multi-faith ties across the organization. And then finally, they were distributing leadership. So leadership choices were not necessarily concentrated in a command and control model at the top, but rather distributed throughout the organization. So one sort of visualization of this comes from our Minnesota case. This is 3 network maps at 3 different points in time, demonstrating how their campaign grew over time. So the green node in the middle is the organizational staff member. The purple nodes surrounding her are the organizational leaders. So this is the distributed leadership illustration. And then the expanding lattice work of relationships you see at time 2 and then at time 3, which is the individual member leaders engaging the members of their network over time. I'm not probably going to be able to walk through all of the slides. So I'm going to signpost here a little bit more about the design choices that we can dig into and question and answer, because I know we want to be able to engage with the audience. But critical to the sort of design choices that we talk about as being at the heart of the PRISM are these dynamic capabilities. And this is something we draw on from the management and organizations literature, the dynamic capabilities literature, which is that organizations that are successfully able to adapt to these shifting conditions and shift their power position at the same time had to be able to sense new information in the environment, seize it, and then transform their activity over time so they were reacting to it. And this was a function of 5 different sort of arenas of structure. So there was this internal structure of the organization. It was how the organization was structured, accountability, as I mentioned, whether or not the leaders in the organization were accountable to the base, and then commitment. And so the commitment factor meant not just were the organizational members committed to the organization itself and willing to stand with the organization, but were they also building ties with one another? So committed and in solidaristic relationship with one another. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to sort of bring that kind of theory into practice with our Minnesota case and tell you a little bit about the faith delegate campaign.
Okay. Thanks, Liz. I'll just get right into it. So the case that this is that I'm going to be talking about today is our Minnesota case. It was an organization called Isaiah. They're a faith-based organization. They've been around for really over 20 years now, and they've been kind of consistently building a base throughout that time. And one of the things that is really kind of consistent throughout kind of the waves of action that they go through is that they're always kind of pushing the Democrats in the state. And in Minnesota, it's called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, the DFL. They're constantly working to try to push DFL legislators and other officials to take more of a stand on racial justice. And this has been really difficult. So actually in summer of 2017, there was a Republican legislature with a Democratic governor, a very chaotic end to the legislative session, where actually the Democratic governor ended up cutting a deal with the Republicans that threw Isaiah's immigrants constituency really under the bus. So they had been working for years to get driver's licenses passed. Driver's license passed through the legislature, and that they had been working with legislators for a long time. And when the governor cut this deal, they were really upset. And so the way that the organizer described it to me was a group of leaders met, they were upset, and they had to make a decision, right? What are we going to do in this moment? So what they decided to do was actually boycott the DFL fundraiser that was coming up. And this ended up putting enough pressure on the DFL where they agreed to fund some research on race and class narratives to try to provide some support for Isaiah's hypothesis that what Democratic officials should be doing is confronting race and putting racial justice at the front of their agenda, as opposed to trying to focus only on class and kind of ignoring the race issue, which is what they were afraid was going to happen. Right. So the focus of the campaign that we really were looking at was the governor primaries, right? So they used this research that they were able to take, and they went to candidates to try to get them to incorporate this language into their campaigns. So how did they do this? So first they had house meetings. So again, like Liz mentioned, the organizations that we studied were always trying to, at the same time as they're advancing a campaign, they're always also trying to build their base. So they started with house meetings. So leaders were getting people engaged in building what they called a faith agenda. The idea being that they would use the agenda that they came up with to advance this, to advance the race class narrative and the racial justice ideas with the candidates. They did this in a really interesting way. Minnesota has caucuses to, determine who is going to be the DFL nominee. So they sent leaders to caucuses with the faith agenda. And the idea was that they would be pushing the faith agenda. So the leaders could choose any candidate they wanted. This was at first. Leaders were able to choose any candidate they wanted and just really push that faith agenda that had been established at the House meetings and had been kind of ratified by the organization. So a couple things there, right? That you see the accountability piece between the organizational leaders and the base. So the base was really bought into the faith agenda. They, had contributed to it. Different constituencies in the organization saw their issue being highlighted in the agenda. And so what ended up happening was the strategy was way more successful than they expected. Probably in part because Isaiah has focused a lot of energy on, getting their leaders to be really strategic and figuring out how to mobilize people. So they actually ended up with enough delegates at that succeeded at the caucuses that they knew that when they went to the state convention, that their organization, if they all decided to vote for one candidate, would be able to actually be the deciding vote in who the DFL would nominate for the governor election, right? So this was an unexpected, kind of a power, like they had an unexpected ability to influence this thing. But the challenge was that the offer that they initially made to the leaders was, you can support whatever candidate you want, right? So if Liz goes to the next slide, yeah. So the delegates initially supported, multiple candidates for the governor primary, and this was the primary field was really, there were a lot of candidates because the governor was going to be retiring, so he was going to be gone. They ended up being able to get all of their base to agree to vote for the same candidate, the candidate that they as a group would decide on, right? So what this meant was they had individuals who were really passionate about a particular candidate, but if the organization decided to support another candidate, they agreed to go with the organization's decision, not their individual preference, right? And they were able to do this because the people that they were working with were really grounded in the idea of, okay, we want to wield power as an organization for our faith agenda, right? So it was a really kind of unconventional approach to trying to influence electoral politics. And they actually ended up being pretty successful in terms of the state convention, right? So at the state convention, their candidate that the organization selected, Erin Murphy, she was an underdog, and she won because of Isaiah. Now, she didn't end up winning the primary, but Liz, could you actually go back to the slide where with the Minnesota results that you showed? So you can see, so the highlighted green part there, that's the primary season, right? So that's when they were really trying to get Erin Murphy, to kind of be the candidate. But she ended up losing the primary, but you can see that Tim Walz, who ended up being the actual candidate, actually also ended up adopting, Isaiah's language as well. Right. So the strategy of the organization was really to try to influence the discourse around the election. And they were able to succeed in part because they had a base that was able to kind of pivot, right? When they had that unexpected opportunity to be able to, shift that, to shift the convention and choose the candidate, they were able to get people on board. And this was in part because they had built really strong relationships of trust among the people, among the leaders, and between the leaders and the organizers. Yeah. I think that's about the summary of it. So to conclude, we'll just go through this conclusion slide and then open it up for questions, right? So our question: how do organizations build and exercise political power given the improbability of their work? So the organizations that were able to shift power shared several key characteristics. They were independent. They were not beholden to someone else's assessment of their value at any given moment, right? So Isaiah was not tied to the DFL. In fact, they were engaged in pushing, the DFL to be more in line with their agenda. They were committed. They are loyal to the organization and to each other. They were flexible and willing to shift as political circumstances changed. And they had distributed strategists. So the organization is made up of a relationally connected network of member strategists, which, arguably is part of what accounted for their ability to be successful in the context of mobilizing people to influence the caucuses. Okay. Well, thank you so much for listening, and we're really looking forward to hearing feedback and questions.
Thank you so much for that. That was really wonderful presentation. Absolutely beautiful slides. To the CSD community, I think sociologists, well, this is a sociologist political science team, maybe, so they're routinely producing beautiful slides, so we need to step up our game. Audience, please enter your please enter your questions in the question and answer area down below. If you want to engage the panelists with a question. And I will start because I'm very interested in questions of the status quo and policy change. My background is in public policy. I've worked with Brian Jones and Frank in my own work and thought a lot about how interest groups may adapt their organizational form given their organizational means to achieve their ends. But one of the things I was thinking about as you guys presented your research was just a question about how the organizations themselves understand some of these core questions you're asking. How do they understand improbability, right? How do they perceive themselves early and later within the network? How do they react to uncertainty? Uncertainty about the political moment, uncertainty about policy possibility. And then, given what we know about how they understand improbability and uncertainty, how does this shape their organizational strategies? In other words, how does their perception of the possible, their perception of the realistic, shape what they're doing at any minute? And when conditions change or when their perceptions change, how do they act upon that? I'll explain. In my work, I'm very interested in policy change and federalism. And one of the things I observe is that, and constantly try to remind graduate students about, is interest groups or activists, they don't like being shut out. It seems likely that when conditions change, successful organizations are often able to switch very quickly to affect change or to act upon that. And those with certain resources are able to do it better. So I'm very interested in this question. How do they think about improbable and probable? How do they think about complexity and uncertainty? And then how does this shape how they think about the status quo and the strategies they pursue? So I know there's a lot, but it got me thinking about a lot. So thank you.
I can weigh in, and Liz and Michelle, do you want to jump in? So I'll also just say that, like, so I think that, like, that question about improbability is like one of the kind of key things that we started with and that motivated the project. And I was really struck by the fact that, like, so many of the organizations that we were working with, because they were grounded in constituencies that were like low income constituencies of color, they were in this position where it felt like, if someone asked them to, like, run a poll and ask, should they try to, like, fight for the agenda that they wanted to pursue, the answer was almost always no, right? Because the polling with data was almost always against them. But they felt like they were in a position where they didn't have any choice except to accept the fact that they had to work for what their people needed, And so I think it wasn't so much they thought about it as being improbable, so much they thought about it as like a moral commitment to pursue an agenda on behalf of a group of people. But that being said, I think what they did take really seriously, even if they wouldn't necessarily have used the words, but that we wanted to kind of bring into this, the way we thought about it from a scholarly perspective more, was this idea of uncertainty, so that no matter what, if you're a grassroots organization, no matter what the issue is that you're working towards, the one thing that's absolutely common across all these organizations is that their power is going to be challenged at some point, right? And they're going to be working in politically uncertain circumstances. And so the question is that if that's the case, if you accept that uncertainty is a fact of the political environment that you're working on, then what are the ex-ante choices that you want to make? And I think part of what we were trying to understand is what those ex-ante choices were, right? Because so much of our scholarship kind of looks ex post and says, oh yeah, like, well, if they were able to raise all this money and, like, generate all this activism, then they're able to sort of achieve the outcomes that we wanted. But we wanted to know how they would sort of anticipate what that campaign might look like ex-ante and then prepare for it. And that's where this notion of pivoting from looking at resources as opposed to strategic choice sets, and then thinking about resource adaptability as like a key characteristic of what the ex-ante choices were that you could make, came into play. So Liz, I don't know if you do want to add something.
Well, I mean, there's a question. I mean, the first question in the chat sort of, I think, relates to that from Roderick. I think I'll just go right to it, but because it's related to the sort of uncertainty. The question is about community-based organizations that work at state level politics. So I know I went through the table very quickly about what our cases were, and a number of the cases that we talked about sounded like they were all operating at the state level. But in fact, our Arizona case, our Ohio case, and the Minnesota case, which we continued to follow, were all also toggling back and forth between the municipal arena as well. So in the case of Arizona, of course, they were trying to, flip the state, turn it blue, push back against SB 1070, but they were also trying to win the Phoenix City Council, and they ended up electing one of their own to the city council. In the Ohio case, that was actually a municipal ballot initiative. So that was a Cincinnati, that was also, I think, a little bit why the network looked different. The operators, the nodes in the network were people who were local businessmen, the local public school system as well. So I think the key point to emphasize here is that because they were so focused on uncertainty, because all of the leaders, most of the leaders in the cases that we interviewed were just always kind of expected that they were going to lose, that if they were actually going to build any power, there was going to be a reaction. Their eyes were wide open to whatever the issue was going to be that was going to allow them to build their organization. So after we finished the research, the Isaiah organization that Michelle profiled ended up getting into a local fight about trash in St. Paul. And like trash, what is like a trash referendum? What does that have anything to do with building and moving forward a multiracial vision for progressive politics in the state of Minnesota? But it was their analysis that actually this is going to be the key issue that we have to wield our base on in order to get in power relationship with the mayor in the case of St. Paul. Michelle, I'm going to let you jump in, but I also think it would be great if we can talk about the overtime dimension that came up in the chat as well.
Yeah, I was looking at David Meyer's question about, how do groups keep people engaged in the context of ostensible defeats? And I think that, one thing that we really want to emphasize is that the leaders in these groups are active in participating in creating the strategy of these organizations. So the organizers spend a lot of time in one-on-one conversations with people. So they have, and the people in the organizations are building relationships with each other, right? So those relationships in and of themselves, I think help the organizations work through defeat, right? So when when that driver's license issue went through, right, the organizer was able to get the leaders to huddle up and, they figured out what they wanted to do to address it. And so I think it having that kind of relationship with leaders, grassroots leaders, it's not like the organizer comes up with the strategy and tells the leaders, this is what we're doing. There's some of that, but the leaders themselves are involved in, creating those strategies. And I think that really strengthens their ability to build a base over time. Also, their willingness to do unexpected things and things that like Hahrie mentioned, that they're not going by what the polling says is the most feasible victory. They're going by what do their members want the most, and what is the thing that we can do to best lay the ground for that. And Isaiah, the decision was, well, we actually need to think about the third phase of power, right, in the political context, the larger political context of the state. And that was really motivating to their base, even more than they expected. Yeah, I don't think I had anything else.
I also just wanted to, I have a slide pulled up, that I didn't get to go through in the presentation that gets to this question about building capacity and connections over time. So much of what we went through in the presentation looked at the individual organization. What were the choices that were happening inside the organization? But of course, all of the groups we studied were operating in these kind of municipal, state, and even national ecosystems of organizing. And so all of them were connected to national networks. But if we look at just the case of Arizona, the network graph here shows sort of the groups that were active in 2006. And so the red nodes are labor, they were tightly connected to one another. And then there were these kind of civil society organizations that were just getting started or just starting to build kind of their organizations and member bases. And then to the over time question, kind of what this looked like a full decade later, I know that's not an extended period of time in the longue durée view of history, but in movement politics, it is quite long. this is what that network looked like in Arizona. So these are the different state tables, the 501c3 and the C4 arms of these different organizations. And then there were groups in the middle, including some of the ones that we were studying that were connected to both of these. And so part of this, when we say building capacity and connections, we're talking about that both at the level internal to the organization and at the level of the movement ecosystem. And a quote from one of our interviewees talked about how this is where I think we're going as a movement right now, dismantling a lot of the so-called infrastructure that's become so process-oriented in favor of these alignment coalitions that are forming capacity through the work together. So that's something I just wanted to highlight because all of the groups we were studying were connected to other organizations as well.
Thank you so much for that. To continue on the questions about how these activist organizations think about time horizon, my colleague Danielle Thompson asked a question that I've been chewing on about how elections think about the shape and structure of the horizon. In other words, how central are elections to organizing and to their long-term views and goals as they engage in organizing and activism.
I can start here too, and I'll jump in and Liz and Michelle. But so I'll say, and this actually relates to one of the first questions also asked a little bit about how these organizations related to kind of community organizing traditions. And for people who know like the history of community organizing, like it traditionally like was did not engage a lot with like traditional electoral politics. And somewhere around, I mean, depending on who you talk to, but like somewhere around the kind of turn of the 21st century, a lot of community organizing networks began to engage more directly in electoral politics. And I think that a lot of these organizations come out of labor, faith-based, traditional community organizing organizations, and certainly were very aware of all of that work as they were doing it. And so I think that on the question of how they thought about elections, it was like elections were the vehicle through which like politics becomes present in most people's lives, and so there are a lot of people for whom like democracy is only experienced every 2 to 4 years, right? When an election comes around or a national election comes around. And I think even though most of these organizations had a core group of constituents with whom they did a lot of this kind of long-term sort of base building work that we're describing, that the elections became the sort of like venue in which that that kind of got projected into a broader public arena, whether it was through like a municipal campaign, like the ones that Liz was describing in Minnesota and Arizona, a statewide election, or sometimes it would be like a federal election as well. But so the election was more thought of, I think, as like an arena for projection of power as opposed to the kind of organizing principle itself. And then the last thing I'll just sort of say on time is that I think all these organizations are like, so we're using the term organization as opposed to campaign, I think instinctively, because all these organizations are thinking about like a long-term organizational horizon, even if they have campaigns that punctuate their work, right? And so it might be that there's a 9-month campaign around a particular election, but they're thinking about a horizon that's much longer on the organizational front.
I'd also just say, as part of doing this work, we were collecting all kinds of data. I know there was a question in the chat about how we built the networks, but the Arizona one that I showed was about co-presence on these kind of formal coalitions. So that they didn't exist in 2006, but they did exist in 2016. But what that meant is that we were able to see other organizations that were not among the 6 in our case study and how they were engaging members around elections and how that was different. And so as part of that research, we have sort of like these built-in comparisons. Since folks are asking about elections, this is data not from one of the groups that we studied, but one of the ones that we came into contact with in the course of doing the research. And what it shows is sort of this boom and bust cycle of engaging members and volunteers around elections. So the even years, you see sort of peaks in terms of how many volunteers were coming in and out of that organization over time, which was quite different than a different set of organizations that we came in contact with, which was kind of a mass action organization that had a regular commitment of about 100 leaders, 100 people over time, and then would every so often have a really large peak or mass action. And so that's sort of what their engagement looked like over time. And then the groups that we were studying, plotting over time how they engaged people, looked a lot more like this, which was sort of steady, sustained leader engagement, the numbers being smaller, but actually the influence they were able to wield being greater in some cases than the other sort of types of organizations that we were looking at. So I just offer that as a sort of visual touch point and the way of thinking about how over time elections, election-focused organizations might look like that, as opposed to the kind of these structured, long-term, durable growth organizations that we studied.
I can speak a little bit to, there's a question about the racial dimensions of this. One of the things that the organizations that we studied, they were really intentional about building multiracial bases. This didn't always mean that all of their spaces were multiracial, right? So sometimes their bases might have been organized, in kind of separate contexts, right? So in New Virginia Majority, they had like an Asian group, they had an African-American, base, but they would come together strategically on issues that were of interest to, the entire base, right? Or for instance, the faith agenda incorporated issues that were of interest to various parts of the base. And they actually used it as an opportunity to build a whole new part of the organization. They had never worked with Muslims before. It was primarily a Christian organization for like 20 years. And then through a variety of events, they ended up being able to bring on some mosques that were really interested in mobilizing, right? So they were, while all these campaigns are going on, they're always kind of thinking about, okay, how can we engage more constituencies? How can we build relationships with, across difference? And then that makes them, I think, a little bit harder to pigeonhole when it comes to, when they're confronting, say, the Democrats. They can't just be put in like this is this constituency, right? Because when they present that united front, I think that, I think that's a choice that they're making intentionally to do that. It's challenging though, as I'm sure you can imagine.
So that leads to a question while you were talking. What were the organizations across the cases again? And so that you don't have to dig it up, were any of them ideologically right-oriented? In other words, many of the things we've been discussing seem to align with progressive policy priorities. And how do you think this study would generalize to the American right, since so much attention has been given to the evolution of right-leaning social movement protests by some of the people in this chat room? Would you expect differences? Do you think these are generalizable across these organizational forms?
I do. I read a book by a sociologist named Gerardo Marti about evangelical churches. And as I was reading this book, I was like, wow, they're doing a lot of the same kinds of leadership development strategies as we are observing in these community organizing groups in those evangelical churches. I haven't looked at it systematically, but my gut is yeah, I think, I think there's some potential for it to be generalizable.
So I'll just say, so part of the reason why we selected organizations on the left was not because we had a presupposition to it, but it was for the kind of study that we needed to do, we needed to get access to a lot of the kind of like internal data of these organizations. Like they basically have to be willing to like open up their guts of their organization to us. And so we just had much easier access on that, for reasons of all of us having worked in progressive politics in the past in various ways, than we did on the right. But in terms of the question about validity, Bob Kuttner had this like great article in the Prospect after the 2020 election where he sort of made the point that the left is collectivist in its orientations, but tends to be laissez-faire in its politics. And the right is laissez-faire in its politics, but tends to be very collectivist in its orientations and how it runs politics, you know? And so most of what we know about like organizations on the religious right and gun groups and like other groups that have been like anchors of right politics, I think tend to have a lot of the same practices in the way that Michelle is describing. But one thing that I'll also just highlight is that part of what one of the questions that people ask us sometimes is like, well, do we really, is it really desirable for organizations to be like building a base in that way? Because part of what we saw on like January 6th is that they can kind of lead to anti-democratic behaviors that are actually quite dangerous in some ways. And so I think one thing I'd highlight is that one of the key things that we found is that all these organizations are building bridging identities, right? So they are engaged as they're building a base, they're intentionally thinking about how they engage people across difference, so people aren't caught in ideological or racial kind of like echo chambers in a way. And so that led to a different kind of pragmatism, I think, that bucks up against certain trends. So one of the things we talk about in the book that we didn't talk about here is that these organizations actually were actually more pragmatic, I think, than is commonly portrayed in the way that people think about social movement organizations. Like they were much more willing to sort of compromise on certain things, or sort of, they try to advance what is traditionally thought of as like a left agenda, but were more pragmatic in their politics than I think is sometimes commonly understood. So.
David Meyer has a follow-up question that I think actually asks you to elaborate a little bit on what you were just discussing, in the sense that he asked, maintaining connections and building leadership over the long haul is tough. And in this presentation, the difficulties of doing this really aren't apparent. We focus on the successes. Think of all the movement campaigns that are unable to sustain themselves over time. What makes the success stories presented here different aside from success? And since you're focusing on organizational strategy and organizational building, you should have some definite answers here.
Yeah, so we did our analytic selection based on success because we wanted to sort of see if there were commonalities across the outliers, right? So the null hypothesis in the study is that there were no commonalities, and in fact, that's what most people told us, right? When we started the study, whether it was social scientists or organizers, they would say, probably what you're going to find is that there's some like idiosyncratic factor, like either a really gifted leader or an idiosyncratic set of like lucky political circumstances that came together to allow for the success to happen. And so the alternative hypothesis is that there were commonalities. And one of the commonalities, I think, points to David's question, which is the idea that the organizations were all focused on building constituencies that had a certain kind of flexibility over time, right? So there was that kind of long time horizon from the outset of how they did their work. And I think as they were thinking about that design at the heart of the PRISM, it's like, how do we build people that are willing to be flexible and stay with us over time? So they were intentionally not trying to build organizations that we're focused on like getting one candidate elected or one election or like one thing like that. And so this goes to Michelle's point when she was describing the Minnesota story, which is that all of these faith delegates initially were told they could support whichever candidate they wanted in the campaign. So some of them like gave money and donated volunteer hours and like put all these resources into other candidates who ended up not being the candidate that Isaiah supported in the election. And they had to make a choice. Am I going to stand with my candidate or am I going to stand with Isaiah? And they all chose Isaiah, 100% of them did, And so that just goes to show that the ex-ante choices that Isaiah had made about how they build this constituency led to a certain kind of flexibility that sort of laid the groundwork for the kind of durability that David's talking about over time, I think.
I'll just add really quickly is that the last chapter of our book is called Fragility. And so we have a whole chapter about sort of what were the setbacks, how fragile were these wins, because every single one of the leaders we talked to described sort of major setbacks. I mean, the Arizona case is a perfect example. They weren't able to stop that bill from getting signed. In Michelle's case of the Minnesota, the candidate they supported didn't end up winning. And so I think, yes, we sort of glossed over that, I think, in the presentation, but sort of a major frame that we've been using throughout to think about how these organizations are different and better able to meet those challenges of sustaining leadership over time is Albert Hirschman's work, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. So whereas for some organizations, as soon as you lose, the bill passes or the bill you lose on the first phase of power, you can exit the organization. What we found is that because these organizations were cultivating voice and loyalty, they were able to do that better than in organizations where members could simply come and go because they lost the campaign and wanted to exit the organization. So it was really like the focus on the voice and the loyalty and the interdependence of those two things, as opposed to sort of the sporadic engagement that we see with a lot of organizations where you're just tied to the issue as opposed to the organization.
Yeah, and I would add that the organizations that we were looking at, organizations are under a lot of pressure to put a lot of energy focusing in on like one issue or one campaign, right? Because often that's where their funding comes from, right? Is to do a particular campaign. And the organizations we studied were intentional about not allowing that to become the primary focus, and instead their focus was always, they focused on the campaign, but they were also always aware of the base building aspect of it, right? So they never really put all their energy into like, if we don't win this one campaign, that's the purpose of our organization. No, the purpose of the organization is to build over time. And they were really aware of and intentional about that, and actually fighting against, a lot of pressures that would, kind of lead them to potentially behave differently.
I think circling back to that point, and I haven't had an opportunity to read the book, you guys are positioned to say something very interesting about venue shopping. One of the, things you're taught when we learn about venue shopping is that organizations are highly strategic in where they opt to pressure for political change and how they develop organizational repertoires for achieving that change. And Elizabeth or Hahrie, I can't recall which one of you said it, but it seems consistent with what Michelle just said, is that oftentimes we might be focusing on the wrong thing when we think about the selection of venues. So I'm interested in you elaborating on that, but with the trash pickup story, it seemed to be that it was a vehicle as much for expanding organizational capacity and membership and advancing an overall ideological agenda as it was to achieve a specific policy goal. Is that the read? And can you elaborate on how they're thinking about the selection of venues relative to outcomes and capacity building?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I hadn't heard that phrase, venue shopping, but it absolutely applies. So in the case of Minnesota, that was about, yes, building the organization, but it was also about political education of the leaders in the organization. So teaching them to do a power analysis of what is at the top of the mayor's concern list right now? Well, he's, a new mayor, there's trash referendum thing. If we go to bat for him and we wield our base on behalf of the mayor, then that's going to put us in a power position with respect to this mayor who we're trying to influence over time. And so much of that campaign was about equipping the leaders to be able to do that same kind of strategic power analysis, to kind of understand, well, this is the issue that matters right now. We're obviously not an organization that's devoted to trash pickup in St. Paul, but this is the lever we're going to wield. And another example I would give of that is the Arizona case once again. So in 2009, Obama had just been elected. The Democrats were in charge of both chambers of the House and the Senate, and Reform Immigration for America really thought that they had an opening to pass immigration reform at the federal level. I mean, this was just like a moment of great hope on the left for actually passing reform. If you think back to January 2009. They lost on that, and not only did they lose on that, but it left them unguarded at the state level. And this was Theda Skocpol and Alex Hertel-Fernandez and others have documented the way in which the right led at the state level through organizations like ALEC to pass. I mean, in fact, SB 1070 was written at an ALEC conference. Russell Pierce was at an ALEC conference when they drafted that bill. So the point here is that here they were focused on this large venue, the national venue, trying to pass immigration reform because they thought they had a political opportunity right for that. They ended up losing, and in so doing lost power at the state level, and that's how SB 1070 was able to pass. They've since pushed back on that. One of the leaders of the immigrant rights movement in Arizona is now the chair of the Democratic Party, Raquel Teran, and so that has changed over time. But you're exactly right that they had to. The venue or the arena in which power was being negotiated was as important of a choice as sort of like what the issue even was at the time.
Thank you so much. I'll give you one final parting question that we've been asking a lot of our guests. I don't need to tell anyone that it's been a tumultuous year for thinking about American democracy or Hahrie, global democracy, right? Social movements and activism. And the work you've done is such a different perspective from what we've been reading. So sort of globally, how has this project shaped your thinking about the health of our democracy, the possibilities and challenges we're facing?
Well, I can start, and I'm curious what Liz and Michelle have to say too, actually. But so I'll say, so we did select on success, and the reason why we selected on it is we wanted to see if there are any commonalities across these cases, to see if, for the reasons that we already talked about. But we also, in doing this work, I think we learned a lot about how countercultural the work that these organizations are doing within the broader political ecosystem. And here I can speak most specifically about it in the United States, where the idea of building organizations that are built on voice, for example, as opposed to a logic of exit, as Liz was describing, is really countercultural, right? Most people expect that they go to an organization and it's like buying ketchup. I want Hunt's or I want Heinz, and if I don't like one, then I just go pick a different product, right? So if this organization isn't doing what I want, then I'm just going to go find another one that is doing the one that I want. And these organizations were kind of trying to build a constituency that operate on a very different logic. And so it was countercultural, both in terms of what the people who were coming into the organization expected, but then also in terms of how they operate within this broader landscape of funders, of political parties, political candidates, and all of these kinds of things. So I don't know that it necessarily, I guess it's like heartening in the one sense that they're out there doing that work, but recognizing kind of how countercultural that work was, kind of, I think, reinforced for me, how challenging, it reinforced for me like why they are outliers, I guess, is what I'll say. The other thing, though, that I will say is that it also made me think a lot about sort of how we think about our work as social scientists. And so we have like a little section in the book where we talk about this idea that the first class that any graduate student takes in grad school is like, methods class, right? And the beginning of methods class is probability theory, right? Where you learn what probability theory is. And like so much of the methods that we use are based on thinking about what is probable as opposed to what is possible. And we're in this moment right now in democracy all over the globe where it feels like we have to be thinking about, as researchers, like what role do we play in helping to imagine what the landscape of possibility is, and then understand what the politics are that are necessary to make it so. And I think that's part of what this book is trying to do. And so there's a way in which I think I learned, it shaped my thinking just in certain terms of like how I think about my own work and what role we play as social scientists in moments of kind of global upheaval.
I'll just chime in and say, so we started this project, as I said, right after Trump got elected, and it was also right before I went to do my dissertation research in Brazil in 2017, where I was studying the rise of right-wing politics in Latin America. So I was sort of prospectively studying what social movements on the right and left were doing in advance of Bolsonaro's election in 2018. And so I like to think about like, that was my sort of pessimistic line of research. And at the same time, I got to work on Prisms, which felt like a really optimistic, hope-giving kind of line of research as well. And I would say, I think, drawing on scholars like Sherry Berman and Dylan Riley in the past, who have taught us that not all citizen activity or civic associationism is alike. I think part of a bias is that just getting more people involved, more people in the street, more activity necessarily has democratic outcomes, and that's certainly not the case. And that was what I saw in Brazil. There were mass mobilizations, really pushing for anti-democratic and kind of authoritarian outcomes. And so what that's taught me as a social scientist is that we have to be really careful about drawing these like granular distinctions. So when we talk about like an organization focused on exit and homogenous or bonding ties as opposed to bridging ties, those are distinctions that we as social scientists have to focus on, as opposed to sort of like lumping all citizen activity together as necessarily kind of this unalloyed democratic good, which it's not. I'll pass it over to you, Michelle.
I haven't been feeling great about democracy in America lately. But I will say that one thing that is heartening, so I did a lot of the kind of participant observation and field research for this. And one thing that really stands out to me is that people found their involvement in these organizations to be worthwhile. People are drawn to want to be in relationship with each other. It can be difficult to build these relationships, but I think that there is potential for this kind of like Hahrie was saying, it's countercultural. There are a lot of forces kind of working against these kinds of organizations emerging, and yet I think that there are reasons to believe that people will build these. Since doing this project, I've become involved in a movement that's like primarily based on Twitter. It's okay, this is kind of embarrassing, but it's the BTS Army. They are it's a group of basically mostly women who are organizing to try to get this K-pop band to be more popular. And honestly, I've noticed that a lot of the same things that we identified in the community organizations that we were studying are emerging in these online spaces. So I think part of what I like about our framework is I do think that there are potential, ways to understand and look at, political activity across a bunch of different spheres, and see these kinds of, activities happening that are empowering to people, and not just, people being kind of used or marketed to, but people actually taking control of their own, agency and trying to make a better world. And I think that there's a lot of people out there who want to be part of something like that. So that's my most optimistic take that I can give.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Elizabeth, I'm very much looking forward to the work on populism and right-wing politics in Latin America. And Michelle, I hope I'm looking forward to an essay on the BTS K-pop movement on Twitter, because both sound just absolutely fascinating, and maybe the direction I was expecting least, but actually really made sense as you talked about it. So thank you so much. Thanks to our presenters for sharing this work with us. I know we're all really excited to read the book. In the chat, I've pasted again a link to the book, and so you can buy it. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the audience for being here. I know our panelists would be delighted to hear from you if you have follow-up thoughts by email, and I'll make this video available moving forward on the website. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been awesome.